first thing people noticed about Eli Carter was not the way he moved through the ranch with quiet competence, nor the dust permanently settled into the creases of his boots, nor even the fact that he had inherited half the valley and still lived like a man who expected nothing from it. It was the silence around him, the kind of silence that followed a man who had learned to endure rather than ask, and for 6 months that silence had grown heavier inside the old ranch house, where every clock tick sounded louder than it should, and every night stretched longer than the one before. Because 6 months earlier Eli's wife had died giving birth to their son, and 6 months earlier he had promised her, standing in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and endings, that he would not fail their child, a promise that felt simple in words and impossibly vast in practice. The baby Noah slept now in Eli's arms as he stood under the porch beam. The child's small fingers knotted into the fabric of his shirt as if even sleep required holding on, and Eli looked out over the corral where horses moved slowly in the early morning light, their breath rising like spirits, and he wondered, not for the first time, how a man who could break a horse, mend a fence in a storm, and ride alone for days could be undone so completely by a child who cried at night. He had tried everything, posting notices in nearby towns, asking the church, offering pay that made men raise their eyebrows and women shake their heads gently, but the valley was small and trust was smaller, and no one wanted to live that far out, not with a widower whose grief was rumored to be as sharp as his temper, and a baby who needed more than anyone could promise. Some came for a week and left when the nights grew long. Some stayed a month and decided the quiet was too loud. Some looked at Noah with fear, as if the child carried the weight of the ranch itself in his small chest. And every time someone left, Eli told himself it was fine, that he could do it alone, that men had done harder things. But at night, when the baby cried and the walls seemed to lean inward, he felt the truth press down on him. He was not failing from lack of strength, but from lack of knowing how to soften. The ranch had been in his family for generations, carved out of unforgiving land by people who believed survival was a virtue in itself. And Eli had been raised on stories of endurance, not tenderness. His father had taught him how to shoot straight and speak little, and his mother had died when he was young enough that her voice had faded into something like wind through tall grass, remembered more by feeling than by sound. Now as dawn painted the mountains pale gold, Eli shifted Noah's weight and felt the child stir, and he whispered words he had never practiced saying out loud, words that came awkwardly like tools, held the wrong way, promises that the baby would be safe, that he would find someone, that things would change. That was when he saw her at the far end of the fence line, standing where the dirt road met the ranch gate, as still as if the land itself had shaped her there. She did not wave or call out. She simply waited. She wore earth-toned clothing that moved with the wind, her long black hair braided neatly down her back, and there was a calm about her that unsettled Eli more than desperation ever could. He frowned, shifting Noah higher on his hip, and watched as she approached with steady steps, each one deliberate, respectful of the land she crossed. And when she stopped a few feet from the porch, she lifted her eyes to his, dark and unwavering eyes that seemed to see past the man he presented to the world and into the tired place beneath. "You are Eli Carter," she said, not as a question but as recognition, and her voice was low even, carrying no fear and no demand. Eli nodded once, cautious. People usually came with explanations ready, with apologies or pleas, but she offered neither. "I heard you are looking for someone to help raise your son," she continued, her gaze flicking briefly to Noah, who blinked awake and stared back with solemn curiosity. Eli felt a strange tightening in his chest, the instinct to shield and to hope colliding at once. "I've heard that before," he said, his voice rough from disuse, and he did not bother to hide the skepticism. "And I've heard the reasons people leave." She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging truth without offense. "I am not people," she said simply. "I am Ayanna." The name hung in the air like something old and rooted, and Eli found himself studying her more closely. The quiet confidence in her posture, the absence of hurry, the way she stood as if she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. "I am Apache," she added, not defensively but because it mattered, because truth mattered. "I know the land. I know children. I know loss." That last word landed heavier than the others, and Eli felt it strike something deep and unguarded. He shifted again, buying time. and glanced down at Noah, whose small hand had reached out toward Ayanna, as if drawn by something unseen. The sight startled him because Noah rarely reached for strangers, and because in that small gesture there was a possibility Eli had almost trained himself not to see. "This isn't a job for someone passing through," Eli said finally. "It's long nights. It's quiet days. It's a baby who doesn't care if you're tired." Ayanna nodded once. "I am not passing through," she said. "And I do not fear tired." The wind moved again, carrying the smell of dust and sage, and Eli realized that for the first time in 6 months, he was standing at the edge of a decision that did not feel like surrender. He did not know why he believed her, only that something in her presence felt steady, like a post driven deep into the ground. He exhaled slowly. "You can stay the night," he said, the words surprising even himself. "We'll see how it goes." Ayanna's lips curved, not into a smile of victory, but into one of quiet acceptance. "Thank you," she said. "I am here now." And as she stepped onto the porch, as Noah relaxed against Eli's chest, as the sun climbed higher over the valley, something unseen but powerful shifted, the way stories begin before anyone realizes they are already inside one. If you feel that shift too, if you sense that this is the start of something deeper than a ranch and a job, stay with this story because what unfolds here is about healing, belonging, and the kind of love that grows slowly but lasts. And if you don't want to miss the next chapter of this journey, make sure you're subscribed, because some stories deserve to be followed. All the way home. By the second morning, Ayanna was already awake before the sun, moving through the ranch house with a quiet familiarity that unsettled Eli more than noise ever could, because he had grown used to chaos announcing itself, crying, clattering, doors opening too fast, but she made no such claims on space, rising instead like the light itself, gradual and certain. And when Eli came down the stairs with Noah cradled awkwardly against his shoulder, prepared for the usual red-eyed exhaustion of dawn, he found the kitchen warm with the smell of cornmeal and herbs, the stove lit low, and Ayanna humming something wordless as she stirred a pot, her presence calm enough that even Noah stopped fussing and watched her with wide, attentive eyes. Eli paused in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt or retreat, and felt something unfamiliar tug at him, not relief exactly, but recognition, as if this moment belonged to a life he might have lived under different circumstances. Ayanna turned, sensed rather than saw him, and nodded once in greeting. "He was hungry," she said gently, as if explaining a fact rather than asking permission. And Eli realized with a jolt that she was right, that the baby's restless movements had been signals he had learned to brace against rather than understand. She took Noah with a practiced ease that startled him, supporting the child's head, murmuring softly, her hand steady, and Eli watched his son settle as if into a remembered rhythm. It should have bothered him, this ease, this quiet authority, but instead he felt a tension loosen in his shoulders that he hadn't known he was carrying over the course of that day and then the next. Ayanna did not attempt to prove herself. She simply was, feeding Noah with patience, rocking him without hurry, singing low songs that seemed to belong to the land itself, melodies that echoed something old and enduring. And when Eli asked haltingly where she had learned to care for children, she told him of sisters and cousins, of community rather than isolation, of a way of living where no child belonged to one pair of hands alone. He listened without comment, absorbing more than he admitted, watching how Noah responded to her presence with a trust that felt instinctive. And with each hour that passed, the ranch house seemed to breathe differently, its rooms less hollow, its silence no longer sharp. Yet Eli did not trust peace. Years of loss had taught him that calm was often the prelude to leaving, and so he watched for signs, hesitation, restlessness, the glance toward the road, but Ayanna offered none. Instead, she walked the land with reverence, touching fence posts as if greeting old friends, speaking softly to the horses, kneeling to press her palm into the soil. And when Eli finally asked her why she had come so far, why she had chosen his ranch among many, she met his gaze without flinching. "Because I heard you were alone," she said. "And because my people know what it is to survive when the world expects you to disappear." The words stayed with him long after she turned away, long after Noah fell asleep against her shoulder in the afternoon light, long after Eli found himself completing chores more quickly than usual, his movements lighter, his thoughts less burdened. That night, when a storm rolled in without warning, Wind rattling the windows and thunder shaking the beams, Noah woke screaming, the sound slicing through Eli's chest with familiar panic. But before he could reach the crib, Ayanna was already there, lifting the baby, pressing him gently to her heart, humming low and steady as the storm raged outside, and Eli stood in the doorway watching, feeling something shift again, this time deeper, as if the ranch itself recognized her right to be there. Later, when the storm had passed and Noah slept peacefully, Eli sat at the kitchen table across from Ayanna, lamplight softening the lines of her face, and spoke of his wife for the first time since the funeral, of the way she had laughed too loudly, the way she had insisted on planting flowers where the soil barely allowed it, and Ayanna listened without interruption, without the awkward condolences he had come to dread, her silence a gift rather than a void. "Grief does not leave," she said when he finished. "It changes shape." Eli nodded, unsure whether he agreed, but grateful for words that did not attempt to fix what was not broken, only wounded. Days turned into a week, and the question of how long Ayanna would stay remained unspoken, hovering between them like a fragile thing neither dared touch, and Eli realized that for the first time since his wife's death, he was not counting the hours until nightfall with dread. The ranch felt different now, not easier but fuller, layered with something he had forgotten how to name. And as viewers listening to this story, if you feel that slow building change, that quiet power of presence over promises, remember that the most meaningful transformations rarely arrive loudly. They arrive the way Ayanna did, steady and unannounced. And if you want to continue walking this path with Eli, Noah, and the woman who is reshaping their world one gentle moment at a time, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next chapter will test the fragile peace they've begun to build, and some bonds only reveal their strength when they are challenged. The change did not announce itself as conflict often does, loud and unmistakable, but crept in quietly, wearing the familiar shape of the past. Because peace, Eli was learning, had a way of drawing attention from forces that preferred things broken, and it began the morning the truck from town kicked up a plume of dust at the end of the drive, its arrival slicing through the ranch's rhythm, like a blade through still water, and Eli felt his body tense before his mind caught up, a reflex born of years spent guarding what little he had left. Ayanna sensed it too, pausing where she stood with Noah balanced on her hip, her gaze lifting toward the road, not alarmed but alert. And when the truck finally stopped and a man stepped out, County Social Services, clipboard in hand, smile practiced but eyes measuring, Eli's jaw tightened as old fears resurfaced, the ones he had buried under routine and exhaustion. The man spoke of concerns and reports, of a widower living too remotely, of a child without a registered caregiver, and though his tone was polite, the implication was sharp. The world was watching now. Eli answered stiffly, each word clipped, while Ayanna remained silent, her presence steady, her hand resting lightly on Noah's back, and when the man's gaze flicked to her and lingered just long enough to categorize, Eli felt a surge of anger rise unbidden, hot and protective, because he recognized that look, the look that reduced complexity to assumption. "She's helping," Eli said firmly. "She's family here." The word surprised him as it left his mouth, but once spoken it felt irrevocably true. The man raised an eyebrow, asked for documentation, qualifications, proof, and Ayanna finally spoke, her voice calm but unyielding, explaining who she was, where she came from, how she had raised children long before paperwork existed to validate care. And though the man nodded, Eli could tell it was not enough that systems built without room for stories rarely made space for them now. When the truck finally left, carrying its unspoken warnings back down the road, the ranch felt exposed, as if the land itself had been surveyed and found wanting, and Eli stood on the porch longer than necessary, staring at the dust settling, fear gnawing at the edges of the fragile peace he had begun to trust. That night he spoke more sharply than he meant to, questioning whether Ayanna should stay, whether her presence might complicate things, whether it would be safer for her to leave before the world made decisions for them, and the words hung between them, heavy and regrettable, because even as he spoke, he knew the truth of his fear was not about her leaving, but about losing what she had helped him rebuild. Ayanna listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, and when he finished, she did not defend herself or argue practicality. She simply said, "I have known people who leave when trouble comes. I am not one of them." The simplicity of it cut deeper than any rebuke, and Eli felt shame settle in his chest. not because he doubted her strength, but because he had nearly betrayed his own growing courage. Over the following days, tension wove itself into the routines they had built, subtle but persistent, and Eli found himself waking at night again, listening for Noah's breath, for the sounds of departure, for anything that would confirm his fear that good things did not last. But Ayanna remained steady as ever, teaching Noah to respond to her songs, taking him outside to feel the grass beneath his feet, telling him stories in a language older than the ranch, stories of resilience and belonging, and Eli watched, torn between gratitude and dread, knowing that the deeper this bond grew, the more devastating its loss would be. The real test came when Noah fell ill, fever rising quickly in the night, his small body burning against Eli's chest as panic clawed its way up from places. Eli had never learned to fortify, and while he fumbled for coats and keys, Ayanna moved with purpose. Cooling cloths, herbal infusions, grounding Eli with a hand on his shoulder, reminding him to breathe, reminding him that fear did not have to lead. They drove to the clinic through darkness and rain, Ayanna in the backseat with Noah, murmuring prayers that felt less like requests and more like declarations of will, and when the doctor finally assured them it was a passing infection, nothing life-threatening, Eli felt his knees nearly give way with relief, a release so intense it left him trembling. In the quiet aftermath, sitting in the parked truck as dawn crept in pale and uncertain, Eli looked at Ayanna and saw with sudden clarity that she had become something essential, not a hired hand, not a temporary solution, but a pillar holding up a life he could no longer support alone. "I don't know how to protect this," he admitted, voice low, stripped of pretense. Ayanna met his gaze, her eyes reflecting both compassion and resolve. "You do not protect life by closing your hands around it," she said. "You protect it by standing when the wind comes." The words settled into him slowly, reshaping something fundamental, and in that moment, Eli understood that strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to remain present despite it. As the sun rose fully and the world resumed its ordinary rhythms, the ranch no longer felt like a place waiting to be judged, but like one quietly asserting its right to exist on its own terms, and Eli knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, bureaucratic, cultural, or deeply personal, they would face them not as isolated survivors, but as something closer to a family than he had dared to imagine. And for those listening to this chapter, feeling the tension tighten and then release, remember that every meaningful story reaches a point where retreat feels safer than growth, and it is the choice made in that moment that defines what follows. So stay with this journey, subscribe to the channel, and prepare for the final chapter, where the question will no longer be whether this fragile family can endure the world's scrutiny, but whether they are brave enough to claim the future they've begun to build together.